Welcome to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paola Fontanelli. Since her father's suicide in 2005, Paola has dedicated her life to breaking the silence around this most stigmatized of subjects. Her book, Understanding Suicide, Living with Loss, Paths to Prevention, was nominated for the National Book Award in Brazil, and the English edition is now available on Amazon.
You may be asking, why talk about relationships in a podcast about suicide? Well, there's so many reasons, but let me just mention two. First, as human beings, we are hardwired to connect. We get hurt by relationships, but we can also be healed by them. In times of pain, a reliable, respectful, and meaningful connection can be the most powerful tool for healing. Having a strong support system is a protective factor against suicide. The second reason for discussing relationships comes from my experience of years working with suicide prevention. Many times, relational difficulties are at the center of a personal crisis, and personal crises are a risk factor for suicide. Also, when grieving, finding support in those around you is key to manage the unimaginable pain of losing someone to suicide. Our approach to explore the theme of relationships in this episode was to explain it through what's called attachment theory. Don't get spooked by the word theory, because this is actually a very simple and quite universal way to look at how we develop our attachment styles, where they come from, and ways to work around some of the challenges that come with them. In this episode, I'm very happy to have interviewed Peter Lovenheim. Peter is a journalist and an award-winning book author. He wrote The Attachment Effect, which is one of my favorite books on relationships. He splits his time between Washington, D.C. and his hometown of Rochester, New York. His other books include In the Neighborhood, in which he explores how Americans live as neighbors today, and Portrait of a Burger as a Young Calf, a first-hand examination of the food chain. You can see more about his work at peterlovenheim.com. Without further ado, I hope our conversation gives you powerful insight into the way you relate to others and helps you strengthen your bonds with those you love. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for participating in my podcast. How are you?
Hi, Paula. Glad to talk with you. I'm fine, thank you.
I was very curious about your book. As you know, I loved it. But as a journalist and not a mental health professional, how did you become interested in relationships so much?
Well, how I became interested in relationships?
Yes, in studying relationships and particularly attachment theory.
Right. Well, the answer to that is kind of a personal story, but I tell it in the book, so I guess I can share it with you.
Mm-hmm.
After 20 years of marriage and 3 kids, I was divorced and in a new relationship. And it had started out well, I guess they all do, but then it became very tempestuous. There were a lot of breakups and makeups and ups and downs, and I had never experienced that before. I didn't understand it and was curious why that was happening. Around the same time, I was visiting my daughter, who was in college, and she was a psychology major. And I was sitting around her dormitory room, leafing through her introductory psych book, and I came across this thing called attachment theory, which I had never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
But in one part of the text, the authors described what can happen when people with 2 different attachment styles, and I didn't know what that meant, try to become a couple. And it said that in that case, the couple can experience lots of breakups and makeups and ups and downs, and it went on to describe to a T exactly what I'd been experiencing. So I was intrigued and I wanted to learn more. And that was the beginning of my research into attachment theory.
We've all been there. We've all had relationships that we don't quite understand. And in retrospect, I totally resonate with you, because when I studied myself attachment theory, I became in love with it. And it's actually my foundational theory today in terms of counseling, because it does explain a lot, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, attachment theory is widely considered probably the most important development in human psychology, child development, social psychology of the 20th century, and it's now very widely accepted internationally as a foundational understanding of human psychology.
And how we relate to each other, right?
Exactly.
So can you please explain to my listeners what attachment theory is? Because it sounds very research-based, but it's so simple, isn't it?
Let me put it this way. Here's attachment theory in a nutshell, as best I can do it. As human beings, we are all born helpless. And we are, let's say, programmed at birth to seek out and attach to a competent, reliable caregiver for protection. Because without that caregiver, we can't survive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the caregiver is usually the mom, but it could also be the dad, a grandparent, or a nanny. But it has to be some primary person who will provide that infant care. And we're talking about from birth up to about age 2, maybe age 3.
Mm-hmm.
The quality of that first bond, whether it's loving and stable or inconsistent or even absent, will then help shape the infant's brain, literally,
Mm-hmm.
and influence that person throughout life in many, many ways. Most particularly, the influence will be on how that person relates to others, how they do in relationships, and also how they respond to distress or loss. That's attachment theory in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's very clear to me, and I'm sure that the listeners understood. What are the styles? There are 3 main styles, right?
There are 3 primary attachment styles. And if you look at any group of 100 adults, they all have an attachment style that they came out of early childhood with, based on those first couple years, based on that initial bond with whoever was the caregiver.
Attachment theory started in the 1950s with the British psychiatrist John Bowlby. His work with emotionally challenged children led him to conclude that a child has an innate need to attach to one main caregiver, and the quality of this bond will have significant long-term impact on how he will relate to others. This is what Bowlby called working model, a framework through which humans understand the world, the self, and others. If this primary bond is disrupted, not meeting the child's needs, for example, or lack of consistency, neglect, this can lead to long-term cognitive, social, and emotional difficulties for the infant. Together with Mary Ainsworth, Bowlby came up with 4 attachment styles: secure, insecure avoidant, insecure anxious or preoccupied, and disorganized. In this interview, Peter explains the 3 main ones. If you are interested in learning more about attachment theory, visit my website, understandsuicide.com, click on podcast, and there you will find more resources.
So the 3 styles are these. First, there's what we call secure attachment. This happens when a newborn receives stable, loving, consistent care. that is responsive to the baby's needs. And adults who come out of early childhood with secure attachment, they tend to find it easy to trust other people. They're comfortable with intimacy. They have a healthy sense of self-worth, and they're generally able to enjoy long, stable relationships, both with friends, with family members, and with romantic partners. So this is the best place to be, to have a secure attachment. And about 55% of adults do have a secure attachment.
So that's good news.
Yeah, that's where you want to be. And if you happen to, if what I just described fits you as a listener, and if your mom and dad are still living, you could call them and thank them because you really got the big prize. Then there are two forms of what we call insecure attachment. The first occurs when an infant just does not receive reliable, sensitive care. This may be because the parent had emotional issues or drug dependency, or just was not able to, or interested in providing care. But if a child consistently does not receive that kind of stable, reliable care, then an adult who comes out of early childhood with that experience generally finds it hard to trust others, is not comfortable with intimacy. In fact, you often hear them say, "What's the big deal with relationships? I'm fine on my own." These people tend to be very self-reliant and like their independence, and they don't want to be encumbered by relationships. This is called avoidant attachment
style.
And
okay.
About 25% of adults will have this type of insecure avoidant attachment style.
So this, just so our listeners understand, so this would be the kind, for example, a child who cries or a child who is hungry and the parent or the caregiver will not pay attention or will not respond.
Well, either they won't respond or they won't respond sensitively.
Okay.
They may not correctly read the baby's signals. So when the baby is hungry, they're not fed. When the baby is tired, rather than helping them sleep, they may be jostled and stimulated as if the baby wants to play. So it could be no care or very much the wrong care.
Okay.
That produces the avoidant attachment style. So that leaves us with one more attachment style, the third one. And really this is the one we ought to be talking about on the subject of self-harm and suicide. This is called an insecure anxious attachment. This happens when an infant sometimes receives that responsive, sensitive care, but sometimes does not. The care is inconsistent, and the infant comes out of early childhood just never being sure whether that protective, sensitive, reliable care will be there or not. An adult who had this experience in the early years is somebody who probably craves a relationship, just craves intimacy, and yet does not find it easy to trust the relationship partner. Again, whether it's a friend, a family member, or romantic partner. So there's this push-pull quality to this person's relationships that is never quite satisfied. There's sort of a hole inside this person that never gets quite filled. People with an anxious attachment find it hard to trust others, and they also tend to lack resiliency when they are faced with all the inevitable setbacks that life brings to us, whether it's a personal injury, illness, job loss, romantic breakup, or the death of a loved one. They find it very hard to cope with that. It takes them a long time to get over that kind of loss. So lack of resiliency is one of the hallmarks of people with an anxious attachment style. About 15 to 20% of the population will grow up with this anxious attachment.
Mm-hmm. And so the anxious attachment, I believe I even sent you some research. I believe I sent you an article that talks about not just anxious, but both avoidant and anxious. There is more suicide related to insecure attachment because, as you know, if you don't have secure attachment, someone that you trust, someone that you know will be there for you in times of need, you may have relational problems, and relational problems may lead to suicide or mental health problems.
That's correct, and I saw that study. It's not surprising to me to read that, because people with insecure attachment, whether avoidant or anxious, are going to have more of a struggle in creating and maintaining healthy relationships. That's not to say that they don't, but it's more of a struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So to the extent that a lack of fulfilling stable relationships leads people to self-harm or suicide, then attachment does play into that and can be a significant factor.
Mm-hmm. Well, can we go on just as a matter of illustration? Can we illustrate that with some examples? For example, how does avoidant or anxious, you can use either one you want, but how do they show up in romantic relationships, for example?
Well, an avoidant person is, as I said, is just not as vested in an emotional relationship. They find it hard to trust people. They don't feel as comfortable with intimacy. So while they may have friends and they may have romantic partners, they're just not quite as keen on continually opening themselves up to what the relationship may require. And when things are tough, they are more likely just to leave. Say, I want to be by myself. I don't need this relationship. I'm fine on my own.
Uh-huh. Especially when you talk about I'm fine on my own, I usually relate that to the avoidant style because they're so self-reliant, and they're usually the ones who dismiss relationship. No, they're not important. It's not a priority for me, and I better take care of myself. That's because they didn't have a responsive caregiving in childhood. So that's
right.
what, yeah.
And they say they're fine on their own, but they're actually not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, internally they are feeling the same kind of loss that other people would, but they just find it very hard to access help. So if a person with an avoidant attachment style gets into a place where they're very uneasy or depressed or under a lot of stress, they're much less likely to seek help from a family member, a friend, or a professional person to try to deal with it, which probably only is going to exacerbate the problem. Their mental model, as you put it, tells them this grown-up is not going to help me anyway, so why am I going to bother, to reach out to her? Why am I going to give her the satisfaction of looking like I need her?
Yeah, and that goes for any kind of relationship. I mean, we're talking about romantic relationships, but it's the same for friendships, isn't it? Or even at work, is it the same? How does it show up at work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting point you make, that when English psychologist John Bowlby developed attachment theory, and this is going back more than 50 years now, he thought he was just developing theory that explains child development and the way young children feel. But over the years, researchers have discovered that these same feelings persist in adulthood, except now we're talking about relationships not between parent and child, but between romantic partners, between friends, and as you say, even between colleagues at work. So people at work who have insecure attachment are going to behave somewhat differently than those with secure attachment. A person, for example, with avoidant attachment at work is probably going to do best working independently, just not fit in so well, let's say, working on a committee. So if a manager knows that, the manager can accommodate a person's attachment style by how they assign a person's work duties. A person with an anxious attachment in the workplace is going to very often be concerned with whether people really like me. Am I really valued? Can I trust my colleagues to keep me informed? Are they going to cut me out of the information flow? And so again, a manager knowing that could help an employee with anxious attachment perform better in the workplace. By the way, there's a very interesting recent study. It just shows that a work team with people of different attachment types, whether secure, avoidant, or anxious, actually produces superior results to a work team with people that only have secure attachments. We can talk more about that if you want to, but it could be a whole new spin on the notion of diversity in the workplace.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point too, because I don't want my listeners to have the idea that, okay, if I have an avoidant, I'm kind of broken and it's a dead end for me. I'll never have a relationship and I really can't relate either romantically or have friendships that are long lasting, because it's not really that, is it? It's just a matter of diversity and knowing yourself, having some self-awareness.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. Recent studies have begun to show that there are some definite advantages to each of these insecure attachment types. And there was a very interesting study that came out of Israel, which I can mention briefly. They put a group of people into a room where they knew everybody's attachment type, and they asked them to look at a computer screen as if they were supposed to analyze the data on it.
Mm-hmm.
But the computer itself had been rigged to start smoking at some point, as if it was about to explode in flames.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was the people with the anxious attachment were the first ones to detect the smoke.
Wow.
Because people with anxious attachment are very sensitive to any kind of threat. So they were the first ones to detect the smoke. But then the people with avoidant attachment, who prized their self-reliance and independence, they were the first ones to find a way out of the room to safety.
So find a solution.
Right, exactly. So it's good to keep in mind, that people do have special traits, whatever their attachment style. And as you say, the real key is to begin to understand that we are all affected by our attachment types, and that if we understand what it is and how it's affecting us, it can really give us a new key to understanding ourselves and then improving our own behavior, maybe working around some of these tendencies, or at least understanding them when they overtake us so we don't overreact to something and realize, oh, that's just my attachment type speaking. I don't have to do this. I don't have to react this way.
And also, Peter, I think it's a good way, if you have that kind of self-awareness, to make better choices in terms of relationships, isn't it?
Well, yes, because in fact, I wrote an article not too long ago about how to tell how to tell your date's attachment style on a first date.
Really? Is there a way to do that? That easy?
Well, I'm not saying you can do it 100%, but there are some clues to look at if you're on a first date and you want to know the other person's attachment type. The reason that's important, though, is that because some attachment types work better than others as a romantic couple. For example, the one combination that generally doesn't work well is if one partner is anxious and the other is avoidant.
Yeah, remember you mentioned that it's the attachment trap, right?
Right. Some people call it the anxious avoidant trap.
Uh-huh.
And the problem there is that the anxious person who's craving relationship, but not quite trusting their partner, is constantly trying to get closer to their partner to be more intimate, even on a first date. But the other person who is avoidant is put off by this request for greater intimacy, and just goes the other way. So you've got this push and pull thing going on, where neither party is really ever fully satisfied.
Uh-huh. So what can help someone who has one of these two insecure attachment styles? How can you work around it in terms of finding a suitable partner, for example?
Well, I think the key is to understand first what your own attachment type is, because that's like a Rosetta Stone. It's going to give you a key to understanding your personality. And there are a couple ways to do that. In my book, I include what's called an attachment quiz. It's just 30 questions. It takes about 5 minutes. It'll give you a pretty good idea of what your attachment style is. But however you find out, once you understand your own attachment type, then you can start to use that in a lot of different ways. I'll give you an example. For example, if I know that I have an anxious attachment, one of the things that people with anxious attachment do is when they're hit with an illness or injury or some kind of distressful situation, they tend to, what we could say, catastrophize. You think the worst is going to happen. And that's usually not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know you have an anxious attachment and you get a cold and suddenly you're convinced you have the coronavirus, you can just sit back and say, you know what, this is my attachment style talking.
Mm-hmm.
I probably don't have the coronavirus. I probably have a cold. But still, it's good for me to go to the doctor and get checked out. In the meantime, though, I don't have to go crazy with worry because that's my attachment style speaking.
Mm-hmm. So do some reality check.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about relating to, do secure people help when they relate to insecure people?
Well, as I say, people who have secure attachment, about half the population, have got the big prize out of early childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And they make really good partners for anybody. So a secure person pretty much always makes a good partner. But the other thing about this learning attachment styles is important because if you know your partner's attachment type, if you know your spouse has an anxious attachment, for example, you can better relate to that person. You can be more loving and patient and maybe give that person more regular, loving reinforcement so they feel valued, they can feel trusting, and they can feel stable in your caring and love.
Mm-hmm.
On the contrary, if you know your partner has an avoidant attachment, maybe you can be more understanding that sometimes this person just needs to be on their own. They need their space.
Yeah, and it's
they
not.
Want to take a vacation by themselves, and that's fine.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean they don't love you. It's just
exactly
that's how they relate. There is just one more way that these two insecure attachment styles express themselves that really caught my attention in your book was when you mention religion and how it affects the relationship with God. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, surprisingly, people's relationship with God tends to look a lot like other relationships in terms of attachment. So a person with an insecure, anxious attachment really may strongly desire a personal relationship with God and want to feel that relationship is strong and steady, and that God is always there with them, and it's a relationship they can trust. So again, if we know somebody who has this anxious attachment and they're able to have such a relationship in religious terms, it can really be a wonderful benefit to their lives, and we can respect that and encourage it.
Yeah, it just fascinated me because when you study attachment styles, you usually read about, and most of the books are more about romantic relationships. So I was really interested in reading your book because it talks about not just romantic, but friendships, how it shows up at work and your relationship to God. And even in grief, you mention it briefly too, which is very important for my audience.
Right. How people get over grief is going to be, to some extent, a reflection of their attachment type. And again, if we know that about them, we can help them through it. It's probably worth mentioning, Paula, that most people, 75% by the studies, will go through their whole lives in the attachment style they came out of early childhood with. Still, some people can change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, this is a change from less secure to more secure. So how does that happen? There's a couple ways the studies suggest that this occurs. Somebody, let's say in adolescence, may get lucky and find a mentor, maybe a sports coach or a teacher who can be an attachment figure for them and over time increase their own security. It can be a therapist. Therapy can help somebody become more secure over time, particularly if you're working with a therapist who understands attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most common ways is by having the good luck to, let's say, marry a person with secure attachment or be in relationship with one.
Mm-hmm. And
over time, the less secure partner can become more secure as a result of that relationship.
Yes. How did I'm curious to know that after you got all this knowledge and you wrote the book, how did it affect you, Peter, personally, knowing your attachment style? And I believe you mentioned in your book that you are insecure. So what does that mean? Can you just explain that?
Well, this is what I was just describing, mm-hmm. that some people who start out with an insecure attachment, as I believe I did, can nevertheless, over the course of their lives, shift more to secure. And the researchers call that earned secure. Mm-hmm. And again, it can come from therapy or mentorship or having the luck of a good partner. Some people think you can become earned secure through parenting, particularly if you're very, very aware as a parent and thinking about your child's experience and then in turn thinking about your own experience. That may be partly how I became more earned secure, according to the person who assessed me. Uh-huh. But I also had a very interesting experience while writing the book. That early relationship I described that first got me interested did not last, mm-hmm. not surprisingly. But while I was writing the book, I met another person, and it was such a different experience because
really,
she would say things that were right out of the textbooks as to what a person with secure attachment says. So, for example, she would maybe get ill, and she'd say things like, "Well, I trust my doctors to do what's best for me."
Wow.
Really? It's, that's what secure people say.
So you learned?
She works in a big organization, and one day she said to me, "Well, at work, I always assume people have good intentions unless they prove otherwise." Again, this is the voice of a person with attachment security.
And here you're thinking, right? I'm hanging on to this one.
Yeah. and like every time we'd get into a little spat or something, she wouldn't overreact.
Uh-huh.
She'd say, "Well, this is just a little problem we're having, but we'll work it out." And
Uh-huh.
Really? Okay, that's a new experience.
Did it also make you relate to your past differently? Because I remember there is a very moving passage in your book about a conversation you had with your father about your childhood. Can you just walk us through that?
Sure. So when I was first starting to research the book and learn about attachment theory, I of course was curious about my own background. And my mother had died, I think 6 years before that, but my dad was still living. He was 95, but still sharp, mm-hmm. living on his own. So I went over to his apartment one day and asked him if I could talk about when I was little. And he said, sure. And he proceeded to explain to me, I mean, I sort of knew the story, but not so clearly, but he explained to me that when I was born, my mom still had a sort of mild case of polio from when she was young. So she was not able to take care of me so well.
Mm-hmm.
So they hired a nanny, an older woman, to live with us. And then it turned out that nanny died of a heart attack when I was 1 year old. So she disappeared overnight.
Mm-hmm. So that was a big
and then
loss.
They hired
yeah.
another nanny, and then when I started speaking, I started having a stutter. So they took me to a psychologist who said that they should get rid of the second nanny and my mother should take care of me because, as he put it, this child doesn't know who his mother is.
Wow, that's very powerful.
Yeah, it was.
Very insightful.
And it explained a lot for me because sort of in an almost classic way, through no one's fault, really. I just had not grown up with a stable primary attachment figure. And interestingly, though, when I read about the history of attachment theory and its developer, John Bowlby, the English psychologist, in writing about his own childhood, he describes a pretty similar set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that his experience led him to research this field, and my experience was probably a big reason why I was attracted to this field and decided to spend 6 years writing a book about it, so other people could understand it and benefit from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in a way, attachment theory also helps you maybe repair relationships, right? Because you do have another perspective on how you relate.
Yeah, I don't have, I think I better understand what my parents' experience was in raising three kids at the time they did. And I understand that even though maybe I have a secure attachment now, my sort of at my core, there's a certain insecurity. But that's had some good benefits too. I think it's the reason I became a writer and have looked at some of the topics to write about that I have, and no complaints. It's just nice to understand it and be able to work with it.
Yeah, and I like when you said to no one through no one's fault when you talk about your parents, because this is not about finding out if your parents were good or bad. It's more about understanding.
But having said that, I mean, that's true. But having said that, it's also true that as parents, we can do certain things with our children that are likely to help them grow up with a secure attachment. And I really believe if we can give our children secure attachment, then we've given them one of the best gifts that we're able to, because raising a healthy, an emotionally healthy child, I think, is a wonderful gift.
It's a legacy that really goes on forever, and it will affect your life. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge.
Well, Paula, thanks for your interest in this. I hope your listeners find it of value.
Yes, I'm sure they will, and I'm sure it will be very helpful for them, either because, as I told you before, my audience is hurting. Usually they either lost someone to suicide or they're at risk for suicide. So I do believe that understanding attachment theory and how you relate to others is a good way to build more trusting relationships in a secure support system, which is so helpful for this population.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Understand Suicide, the podcast of journalist and therapist Paula Fontanelli. If you've been touched by suicide and believe your story might help others, please consider contacting Paula through her website, understandsuicide.com.